Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavoston, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which I feel strongly in my soul count.
Wow, we're bringing the soul into this already. Well, I'm the mischievous Mark Ginocchio. I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals. But the annuals don't count, although I don't know if I'm ready to put my soul up for auction in exchange for this debate. You're just kind of taking it to a new level, Dan, and I'm uncomfortable now.
I mean, I'm willing to go to Peter Parker's lengths to save Aunt May's life, but this time over annuals. So, I might be an even bigger patsy, but, thank you everybody for joining us for our beyond amazing celebration of Spider-Man's 60th anniversary on the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe.
If you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app. Every other week, we put out a mainline episode of our flagship show, and sprinkled in between, we review new comics as well as interview some of the greatest Spider-Man creators of yesterday and today. So this is the perfect time to start listening.
Yeah, and I will issue a quick reminder. We have our secondary feed, the Amazing Spider Talk back issues, with some of our oldest content as it gets buffered out of our main feed. So if you're looking for interviews with like Mark Bagley, the legendary Tom DeFalco, all of our oldest friends, Jerry Conway, they are going to be over in the Amazing Spider Talk back issues feed. So go check that out and leave us a review if you can. But Mark, what are we going to be doing today on the show?
Yeah, this is a new issue, Dan, and it's a heck of a new one. We will be continuing our Beyond Amazing celebration of Spider-Man's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15, 60 years ago. With each episode of the series, we're going to be taking a very specific lens and applying it to the history of the character. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the prime specimen itself, the reason for our celebration. That's right. We are talking about Spider-Man's origin in the pages of Amazing Fantasy number 15.
But Mark, talking about a legendary story wouldn't be enough for a celebration as special as its 60th anniversary, so we brought in Marvel editor and contributor on the upcoming book, Spider-Man Panel by Panel, the equally legendary Tom Brevoort. Welcome back to the show, Tom.
Why, thank you. And we settled this question the last time I was here. The annuals count.
Yeah. I didn't want to pull out that trump card, but thank you, Tom.
That's just a fact.
I will concede just because you are. We have a couple of legendary Toms that have been on the show. You are the current legendary Tom, and I don't want to show disrespect to our guest here, but I do want to say when the curtain closes on this episode and I slink off into the night thinking about the lessons I've learned, the annual fight will continue on. So I'm just putting that out there.
Well, Tom, in our introduction to you, I mentioned this new book that's coming out in October called Spider-Man Panel by Panel that you contributed to. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that book and that project?
Sure. It's not really my book. It's published by Abrams. It's really the work of Chip Kidd, and very much like the Fantastic Four #1 panel by panel they published last year. It takes Amazing Fantasy 15 and Chip blows up and redesigns all of the panels to fill an enormous size so that you can scrutinize them much more closely than you might have been able to otherwise. It also contains a number of historical essays about the making of Amazing Fantasy 15 and some behind-the-scenes stuff, some of which I contributed. But it's essentially the Amazing Fantasy 15 version of the FF1 book.
So have you got your hands on a copy of this thing yet?
Oh, no, not at all. I haven't seen a frame from it. I'm not sure that it's all put together quite yet.
Okay, cool. I mean, since you haven't, was there anything that you took, like the Fantastic Four book, was there any kind of like detail that like appeared to you through that kind of examination process? Just purely enlarging them?
A little bit. I had done years ago on my website, I had done a fairly thorough walkthrough on Fantastic Four 1 and 2 and 3, and I've in years since done things like pull the Marvel in-house stats and study those up close and so forth. So, really, as much as anything, the material that was in the Fantastic Four panel by panel book was all sort of reworked from pieces that I had written and posted years ago. So they were a little more polished. There's a couple of new tidbits in that book versus the version that's online, but it all kind of drew from that. And the Spider-Man book is kind of the same thing. I had done a couple of different pieces on the making of Amazing Fantasy 15, so I didn't have to do a whole lot of writing for this. It was more rewriting and reincorporating and taking 2 or 3 different bits and combining them into a single piece. So again, I went into that story really close, and because the original art exists at the Smithsonian, when that was first donated to Marvel, to the Smithsonian years and years ago, the Smithsonian reached out to Marvel, and they provided us with incredibly high-grade scans of all of those pages. It's what we use today to reprint those stories. And I have copies of all of those files. I saved them at the time, and I downloaded them. And they're as close to having the original art in my possession as it is possible to have. And so I studied them up close. I ran them through Photoshop, and I adjusted the gains real high so you could start to make out, the pencil lines that were still on the boards that showed up in the scans and so forth. And so, in these pieces, I was able to reconstruct little editorial notes that were in the margins and corrections and things. And that indicates, that gives some background on the making of this historic story. But it's all stuff mostly that I had done before. In preparing the stuff for the book, as happened with the FF1 book, when I went back and looked at stuff again and came back to it fresh after a couple of years, I saw a few things either differently or that I hadn't seen the first time. So again, there's new material in the book version versus the essays that are still available at the site. But it really is about as minute a look at that 11-page story as it's possible to have, for me at least, to have done. Somebody else might have been able to do a better job, but
for some reason, I just had this vision of you like pulling a Nicolas Cage and breaking into the archives and finding a map on the back of Amazing Fantasy 15. But
no map, but there was definitely some stuff hidden in it. And as we go through this, I have my copy of the essay opened here, so I'll refer to it fairly regularly as I don't remember all the minutiae of this 3 or 4 years later. But there's some stuff that you wouldn't know from just looking at the printed comic.
Sure.
Gotcha.
Tom, last time you were here, you told us about the first time you discovered a Spider-Man comic and your kind of loose collection at various Comic-Cons that pulled the whole thing together. But I'm curious, what was your first encounter with Amazing Fantasy 15? And what does it mean to you?
I think my first encounter with Amazing Fantasy 15 was in Origins of Marvel Comics. I think that's the first time I read it. The second time I read it would have been in the 1970s pocketbook collections of Amazing Spider-Man, the first volume, 1 through 6, in Amazing Fantasy, which I got second. I got the second volume first, 7 through 13, and then sometime later I ended up getting the first volume. So I read it in Origins first. It's a pretty impactful story regardless, and it was already sort of historic at the time in the 70s when that book was being published. Beyond that, I guess I had the same sort of reaction to it as everybody. Spider-Man's got weird pupils on the last page. That's strange. And then, since then I've read it in a million different reprints and collections and things. And, I have a copy of Amazing Fantasy 15, so I read it that way, as both of you have, I assume.
Well, Tom. I mean, I'm always one to put people on the hot seat here. So I got to ask you, as kind of the Marvel resident Marvel historian here. I mean, we're biased, but I mean, is this the greatest Marvel origin in your opinion?
It's always difficult to quantify anything that specifically.
Okay.
But if it's not, it's damn close.
Yeah.
It's got to be in the top 3 at least, maybe the top 2, and maybe it is just pound for pound, purely all around the best. Particularly given the length of it, particularly considering how well it still works today, 60 years later. That we've seen it reprised and redone in animation and on film and in every other format you could imagine, in newspaper strips, and it still functions, it still works with very little change. Maybe Peter Parker's not wearing a weird 1950s sweater vest. These days when you tell this story, but the essence of it works regardless of the age. And it's one of the things about it that I don't know if people really stop to consider is, on a certain level, it's almost like a parody of the Batman origin. That's the kind of story it starts out to be. Here's a guy, and he gets into this thing, and his parental figures are killed and so forth, and it follows that sort of parallel, but goes in completely different directions from it. He's not a rich guy. He's a poor kid, and he gets his powers and wants to cash in on them, as opposed to immediately becoming a world-renowned crime fighter, and so forth and so on. Like, you can see the influence of particularly the classic Batman that was very much a part of Steve Ditko's upbringing, and was, I think, just a big influence on the kind of strip that Spider-Man was going to be.
Well, we know this is Spider-Man's origin story. That's if there's one thing that people know about this comic. But, are there other things that stand out about it to you in regard to its place in Marvel's publishing history?
Well, I mean, really, it was also the first publication of that classic fantasy story, The Bell Ringer. So who could forget that, or The Man in the Mummy case that we just did a sequel to.
Yeah, I was going to say.
1000. Really the reason people remember this comic and don't remember Amazing Adult Fantasy 14 is because of Spider-Man. It's all about Spider-Man.
But that's what Disney Plus is for. Now we can get all of those stories out. No.
I like The Martians Walk Among Us. That's a favorite of mine. But just for Twilight Zone-y goodness. But okay.
I will say one thing to maybe think about, and this is something that I think it was Greg Theakston who first pointed this out in some article he'd written back in the 80s. Is that if you look at the cover to Amazing Fantasy 15 in the context of the 14 issues that come before, it's not readily apparent that this is a superhero comic. I mean, yes, we can look at Spider-Man now and recognize that what he is wearing is a superhero costume, but given that the previous 14 issues included giant monsters and weird creatures and fantasy things, you could entirely look at that cover and go, he's some weird thing that's making off with this guy.
And his friends on the roof just want him back.
he's like another alien threat, for all that it says, introducing Spider-Man. It's not as readily apparent, in part because of that full face mask, which just makes him look creepy and alien. And if you don't know that's a full face mask, if you haven't opened the comic and seen it, that could just be the guy's face. He's a weird thing, a monster, an alien, or whatever. He's just a creepy bug man.
Especially if they had left those dot pupils on him. Now I want to Photoshop that together. Speaking of details, I think we should talk about what we're going to be doing here today. So, listeners of the show may have heard our episode with Ron Friends where we deconstructed the kid who collects Spider-Man. But today we're going to be talking about deconstructing page by page Amazing Fantasy 15. So if you have a copy of it and you are daring enough to get it out, or you have a reprint, or you're even got
break
Marvel
the seal on your CGC case.
Yeah, right.
Or follow along.
You've got Marvel Unlimited. Break out your copy of Amazing Fantasy 15 and join us as we turn page by page. We're going to start with the cover, and with each page, we're going to give a description of what you could find there if you don't have a copy of the comic, or you just don't want to break that seal, like Tom was saying. And then Tom and we are going to have a discussion about what's on the page and hopefully learn a little bit more about this comic that we all love. So let's get started, shall we? And no better place to start than with the cover. We're going to talk about the Kirby cover here. So the Kirby cover is marked with a date of August 1962. Amazing Fantasy 15 was sold for 12 cents and features a cover introducing Spider-Man, who we're told is actually the timid teenager Peter Parker. This strange red and blue costumed character heroically swings on a line, his chest puffed out, with what appears to be a criminal under his arm. Speed lines emphasize the haste he is making as he rushes away from a building covered in an assortment of criminals who seem to have chased him to the rooftop, guns in hand. I think it's important to note that there was also a Steve Ditko alternate cover that wasn't used, but has subsequently been printed elsewhere. But we're going to start by talking about that Kirby cover. Tom, what stands out to you? We talked a little bit about this cover, but looking at it now and looking maybe at the original inks, what stands out to you about this cover?
Well, I think you kind of do have to go back to the Ditko cover first.
Okay, let's do it.
On Amazing Fantasy 15, the cover was produced after the story. It was the last thing that was done for this. This wasn't always the case. In a lot of cases on different Marvel jobs, the cover came first. And often on a book that Jack Kirby did a cover for, he would design the villain of that story on the cover, particularly on titles where he wasn't drawing the interiors. So on an Iron Man cover for Tales of Suspense or something, he might design the villain that Don Heck would end up drawing on the interior. But Ditko's pattern was always to do the cover last, after the interior stories had been done. So the cover he did was the unused cover to Amazing Fantasy. And it's got a couple of facets that are interesting to it. One is simply the fact that it wasn't used. Wasn't used at all. Which, on the face of it maybe seems strange, since Spider-Man is so much a product of Steve Ditko's particular visual sensibility. But the concern, as I understand it, from Stan Lee and possibly Marvel's publisher, Martin Goodman, who tended to have a lot of opinions on the covers. He really didn't care about the stories. He felt the cover was what sold the magazine, and so you needed the grabbing cover, and it needed to silhouette nicely, and it needed to, hit certain benchmarks. The Ditko cover didn't seem impressive enough. Interestingly, in the lettering for that cover, that original cover, there's a new logo. That with this issue of Amazing Fantasy, the book up to this point, since issue 7, had been called Amazing Adult Fantasy. And every issue it featured 5 stories, short stories by Stan and Steve Ditko that were kind of Twilight Zone-esque. Stan was trying to do something a little more sophisticated, hence the name adult in the title. And the sad reality is it didn't work. It didn't go over. It didn't sell that great. So the idea here was we're going to introduce Spider-Man as a character into the series, and that'll hopefully be enough to save the title. It's why there's a blurb even on the Ditko cover saying, also in this issue, an important message for you about the new Amazing. And if you read the actual issue, there is a text page that replaces the usual letters page, where Stan, in his usual, not 100% truthful, but doing the Cell way, kind of says, "Oh, it's just been too hard to come up with all those Twilight Zone type stories. So we're going to do Spider-Man instead for a while, and maybe if you like them, we'll do 2 Spider-Man stories every issue, or we'll do longer stories. Whatever it ends up being, this is what the comic is going to be from now on." And for years, the legend, and Stan perpetrated this because Stan loved a good story, was that they only ran Spider-Man in the last issue of Amazing Fantasy because he had this crazy idea and his publisher didn't like it, and so they put it in because it was already canceled. That's all untrue. The intention was for Spider-Man to be the lead in Amazing Fantasy moving forward, and in fact, the next 2 stories had been started and partially completed by the time they pulled the plug on it, and those became the lead stories in Amazing Fantasy 1 and 2. But anyway, the other thing that's interesting about the Ditko cover that we'll get to when we get to the splash page is there's a logo for Spider-Man on it. It's that curved logo that's also on the splash page of Amazing Fantasy 15, and it includes the dash. And that's noteworthy in that, other than in this logo, at no point in this comic, including on the replacement Kirby cover, is that dash there. Spider-Man is consistently written as a single word. The inclusion of that dash was a relatively last-minute decision, it seems like, and a way of trying to distance the character from other characters that there might have been confusion or problems with. It was a way of trying to separate it and make it unique. But it didn't really stabilize and become a regular thing until about Amazing Spider-Man 2. Like in issue 1, particularly in the story that was originally prepared for Amazing Fantasy 16, it's still most often one word. It's inconsistent.
They also called him Peter Palmer in Spider-Man 1, so...
Yes.
Point made.
And part of the reason for that mistake is that it had been 8 months since Stan last wrote a Spider-Man story, and he just forgot in that time.
I mean, he had the alliteration, but
Yeah. So the Kirby cover, Jack was doing pretty much all of the covers for the superhero and fantasy and Western books at this time. So it is no surprise at all that Lee called him up and said, "Hey, we want you to do a cover for this Spider-Man launch." And it certainly looks to me like they either described to Jack or actually showed him the unused Ditko cover. And Stan went, Ditko did this cover. It's a down shot. I don't like it. It's not dramatic enough. We need it to be powerful. We need it to be exciting. And Jack went away and did his version of the same image. Like the image of Amazing Fantasy, that cover that we recognize is ultimately based on the concept that Ditko came up with. It's just framed in a much more classically Jack Kirby sort of a fashion. The jutting diagonal buildings and the hero with his chest thrust out, like you say, and even the posture on the dangling crook. In the original version of that cover, Kirby had the web line that Spidey is swinging on go a lot further. It crosses in front of his body, and they whited all of that out to try and silhouette the character a little bit better. Also, there's a different set of lettering for Spider-Man on that cover. It's broken into 2 lines, but there still is no dash. It's still just Spider-Man. And most of the coloring on it, the clouds of the sky, the streaks as Spidey and the crook swing by, all of that was added after the fact in color. None of that was drawn by Kirby.
So Tom, I've always been curious about like these covers, between the Ditko and the Kirby cover. You noted the differences in the like lettering for both the title and the Spider-Man name title with the hyphen is in the Ditko one, but not in the Kirby one. But but the word balloons and the also in this issue message are the same. Is that just a function of them, copying from one to the other? And who would have done something like that?
Well, the lettering on this cover was probably done by either Art Simek or Sam Rosen, who were the two main letterers at Marvel at the time. And they definitely copied certain elements over into the new cover, the next issue box and the two balloons, although they moved them around and changed the tails to make them work in the new image rather than in the old image. And that would have been a production thing. They would have statted that in the office, and probably Sal Brodsky would have done the paste up to put them onto the new piece. They also did, for whatever reason, a new version of the Amazing Fantasy logo for the published cover, that there was a logo on the unused Ditko version, and that's not the version that was used here. It's also, in neither case, is it the version that was used on Amazing Adult Fantasy 14 the month earlier. So for whatever reason, when they looked at the unused Ditko version, somebody, Stan or Martin Goodman or whatever, wasn't happy with that logo, and they had it redone.
Was that level of tinkering common back then? I mean, it seems like a lot of emphasis on this one issue to completely redo a cover.
The honest answer is, particularly on covers, there was always a ridiculous amount of tinkering. And if you go through the history of early Marvel, the first 10 years, it's rare that you can't find a cover where something has been changed. And if you compare the reprints that have been done over the years to the original published comics, you can often find small little changes and tweaks that were made, some of them bigger than others. There were certainly instances where covers were tossed out completely and new covers were done to replace them because something about the original just wasn't working for Stan or for Goodman. There are a couple of those on Amazing Spider-Man. On the Amazing Spider-Man 10 cover is mostly a Kirby cover, big Kirby Spider-Man with three little Ditko enforcers and the big man. And we've seen, there's an unused Ditko Spider-Man 10 cover that just wasn't used. And presumably, there was some, whether it was real or not, there was some concern that cover as it was put together was a problem or too difficult to read or too cluttered or whatever, and they went in and did that. On other covers, sometimes it would be a comics code thing. There are covers where characters, in big Kirby coming at your hands would have claws or extended fingernails, and the code would say, take the fingernails off, it's too scary for the kids. Or they would move an element away from the trade dress. There's an Avengers cover, Avengers 23, where Kirby's drawn it with a big hand up here of Kang, and they kind of shift the hand down because they need room for the corner box. So this sort of minutia and picking at the covers in particular, in this era, because it was all impulse buyers, and the feeling, the established wisdom of the time was the cover sold the comic. You get a good cover, you grab the kids, they drop their dime and 2 pennies, and you're golden. That was what was focused on more than any other aspect of the book. And Stan, even beyond the time of where Goodman was a real force, really had that ingrained into him and was constantly looking and tweaking and adjusting stuff, sometimes for no really good reason other than maybe this will be a little better, maybe this will make it a little stronger. Being a perfectionist about the work that was being done. And it's difficult to measure how much of that made any difference at all. Certainly doing an entirely new cover clearly is going to make some difference.
You spoke a little bit about the archives. I'm curious, maybe this just covers it in general. There was the anonymous donor that dropped these original art pages off with the Smithsonian. What was this Jack Kirby cover included in that? Or was the Steve Ditko original cover included in that?
No. It's the whole, typically the way original art books were filed, the original art was saved and in the Marvel warehouse, you would get the entire original art for a book in an envelope altogether back from the printer, and you would get the covers separately. And that's because the covers were printed differently. It was on different paper. It was done at a different time. Typically, the covers were printed before the interiors, and then the two were stapled and married together. So you didn't typically get the covers in the same package as the original art for the rest of the issue. And when that stuff was returned and then haphazardly stored in the warehouse, they just took those folders, and put them on shelves, and that was it. And so you'd have all the covers somewhere, and you'd have all the actual books somewhere else. So the Library of Congress does not have, as far as I understand it, either cover to Amazing Fantasy 15, but they do have all of the story pages, and I think the editorial pages. So the editor's note to the readers, I think they have the page for that. Anything that was considered content would have been in that big manila envelope with all the original art.
So does Marvel just have a scan of this Ditko unused cover that they pull from? Like, where was that discovered?
The first place it was printed was as the back cover to an issue of Marvel Mania, the fan magazine that was published in the 60s, and it was printed in black and white, and it took up the whole of the back of this magazine-sized fan magazine. So it was good enough that you could reproduce off of it and reprint it again later on. And I think, I don't know specifically what source material we're using for it these days. I'm guessing it all goes back. It can all be tracked back to that printing. Because that's the best reproduction of it, I think, that it's ever gotten. And it's nice and clean because it's in black and white. But it's been printed a bunch of different times. It was the back cover to one of the Spider-Man indexes, and it's shown up in, I think, in a couple of anniversary issues and things. And they repurposed the art for a variant cover on Spider-Man 700. So, clearly we have a decent reproduction copy of this lost cover. Good enough that we've been able to reprint it over the years.
Well, let's turn the page to the first page of the interiors. Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about what goes on in this first page?
Yeah, of course. So this is the splash page, of course. And as Tom noted earlier in the episode, we have the original Ditko Spider-Man with a hyphen and an exclamation point logo at the top, and a little Spider-Man guy to the right looking very Ditko-esque. Over to the left, we have a group of kids, one of them pushing one out to the side, who's standing out with a silhouette behind him with a spider web, and an imposing figure kind of silhouette behind him. In the narrator's box in the top left of the page, we are introducing Spider-Man without the hyphen as something different from the quote-unquote long underwear characters most are used to. And I'm thinking again of what Tom was just saying earlier in the episode about kind of the inversion of the traditional superhero story a la a Batman with what we got here. So we learned that this lonely, mocked, and ostracized student is Peter Parker. His classmates say he doesn't even know a cha-cha from a waltz, and they are pushing him aside. And Spider-Man is we will learn later, of course, that the silhouette behind him is Spider-Man and what he is to become. But that's spoiler alert, I guess, for a 60-year-old story. I always love this splash page. I mean, I think it just tells so much story in one visual about what we're about to get into. But Tom, would love to hear what you think, what you see in this page.
Well, again, looking at the original art, there's a bunch of things. The first of which is there's a ton of whiteout up by where that curved Spider-Man logo is. And the reason there's a ton of whiteout, that when the Library of Congress, when they first got the donation, they looked over the boards carefully. And that Spider-Man logo is a stat. It's the same lettering that was on the Ditko unused cover. And the way you use a logo is you do it once and then you stat it, which is photostatically reproduce it for each subsequent use. So that was dropped in here, and so somebody at the Library of Congress kind of went in, because the paste that was on it, keeping it together, was old, and peeled up the corner of it, and underneath it, it's apparent there was another Spider-Man logo. It's a Spider-Man logo that had no dash. It was all done in these sort of weird webby lines. And there was a full web pattern that made up like a panel at the top of that central image of the splash page. So Spider-Man, that little tiny figure of Spider-Man, he's just not like sitting there in white space. He's at the center of a radiating web that goes out and that encompasses the logo. I am guessing, and it is only a guess, that they made this change because they wanted to introduce the dash. They wanted to make that that statement and make it clear to help separate this character out from the other characters. The other thing that's worth noting about this splash page is that Liz Allen's face was not drawn by Ditko. That was art corrected. It was art corrected by Al Hartley, who was the artist on Patsy Walker, and this is clearly a case where Stan didn't feel that Ditko's forte was drawing cute, pretty girls, and so he got his cute, pretty girl artist on some day that he was in the office to just go in and make her more cute as a button on this splash page.
And what about the Peter standing in front of the wall? I mean, beyond like looking at the original printed art or the original artwork before print, like does this page have any special meaning to you? As an editor, you look at this page, what do your eyes see that maybe we're missing?
Well, again, going back to the question of this being an inversion of a typical superhero strip, this is the kind of image that you would see a lot in 1940s Batman comics, where you'd have a figure, whether it was Bruce Wayne or a Batman figure, and they'd have the huge bat silhouette projected behind him. The idea of seeing the normal person and the superheroic alter ego as a motif was kind of something that was already established here. So this is playing with those conventions, except the guy that we're looking at isn't a millionaire playboy or a well-to-do reporter or whatever. He's this sort of schlubby guy, on this high school campus who's already separated and ostracized from his entire social peer group. In essence, this kind of gets across the sense of who Peter Parker is, which is good and which is important for a reason we'll talk about in a page.
And people have made a lot of like Peter's looks as being similar to that of Steve Ditko. Do you buy into that kind of like self-insert idea?
I don't know that Ditko at this point was drawing Peter Parker necessarily as a self-caricature or anything, but I think that like all artists, he drew on his own background and his own experiences. I don't know that Ditko thought of himself as a nebbishy, science-minded high school student, but some of the clear iconography of that is Peter wears glasses in all those early stories, which was always a shorthand for he's a brainiac, he's a smart nebbishy kid, and even the clothes, the sort of standard Peter Parker, sweater vest and tie and button-down shirt. This comic was released in 1962, but it feels more like something that a kid in high school might have been wearing in the 50s or earlier. Yeah. And that really feels like a throwback to Ditko as well. That having been said, if you look at photos of Ditko, there are a couple floating around online from his high school yearbook and so forth. He does look remarkably like the early Peter Parker. He had, a short, well-groomed haircut. He wore glasses, and he was not like physically buff. He was a relatively small guy. So there's definitely, even if it was just him looking in the mirror to get expressions right or whatever, there's definitely a connection between who Steve Ditko was and who Peter Parker is.
One of my big takeaways always from this page that always kind of calls to me is how when you look at Flash's hand, I mean, he's literally pushing out against Peter to the side. I mean, you talk about there being an outcast. I mean, he's pushing him out of the circle. I guess in retrospect, is this considered too on the nose? I mean, could if we do this today, are we like, oh, come on, how obvious can you be? I mean, like, or is this still considered pretty good storytelling from a visual standpoint?
I think it's pretty good in that you don't need a single word to understand this image. Like if you took all the balloons and the copy off of this and just showed somebody that image, they would be able to tell you and describe to you what is going on there with crystal clarity. The comic book artists of this period, Kirby in particular, and Ditko as well, and all of their contemporaries, tended to use what I think of as theater acting in their characters, which is to say they would exaggerate movement and motion and stance so as to communicate to, in theater, the back of the audience, or in comics, visually and clearly to an audience who, particularly in 1962, the common wisdom was pretty young and maybe couldn't read that well. So the visual component really had to carry the day. You had to make an image here that conveyed to even your youngest reader what the situation is, even if they can't understand all the big words like long underwear character.
And I've always been drawn to the signatures of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko down at the bottom of the page. There's a lot of these early books didn't always credit the people working on them for the work that they did, but like their names are right down there, standing out. It always pleased me to see, like, and also knowing that looks like it's actually their signatures, unless Ditko was doing his best Stan Lee signing.
I think it's the other way around. Having looked at it, that's definitely Stan's handwriting and his sort of stylized signature with the combined ST and Stan. And I think the S. Ditko was probably done by him as well.
Oh, interesting.
Stan tended to, in these days, and for most of his career, to sign any story that he himself worked on. It's one of the clues that you can look at if you're looking at stories from the 40s or 50s or 60s to try and figure out which ones were genuinely written by Stan and which ones were written by some other, of a bevy of faceless, almost forgotten creators. Stan tended to sign the stuff that he did, sometimes by himself, sometimes with the artist. He would sign with Dan DiCarlo often on the girl strips, and with Joe Maneely on occasion on the westerns and things. And so this was sort of par for the course. And Fantastic Four at this point, before they'd developed actual credit boxes, those would be signed Stan Lee and J. Kirby, and the same thing, just written in.
Great. Well, let's move on to page 2. So everybody turn the page, and be careful not to damage it in any way. I'm like having a nervous breakdown here, just telling people to turn a page. But page 2, Peter is awakened by Uncle Ben and fed wheat cakes from his loving Aunt May. At school, we see Peter's successes in the science classroom and failures at courting women. His invitation to a science exhibit is rebuked by the big man on campus, Flash Thompson. As his peers drive away and Peter approaches the science exhibit, he thinks about how sorry they will all be someday. So we're getting to our first truly 9-panel heavy. I guess it's really 8 panels here, but we've moved past the splash page. We're into the meat of the issue. We got Stan's dialogue just drowning this thing in a wonderful way. Tom, what stands out to you about this first page?
Well, I tell you, the biggest surprise that the original art shows us is at the bottom of this page, written in grease pencil across the bottom, is an instruction. Bill, shoot this page too. Give to stripper, which would have been the film stripper that was putting the book together. That appears to be a note that was made at the printer, but it opens up a whole can of worms. Because why would you not have this page in the book? Was it added after the fact, late in the game? If you look at the story and you take this page out, it still works. Like, you can go from that splash page immediately to Peter is at the radiation exhibit, and
Right.
all you've really lost is a bunch of characterization. That characterization is important, but it's entirely possible, although maybe not likely, that this page wasn't intended to be there when Ditko brought the first version of this story in, and it was added sometime later in the process. It's also possible that somebody at the plant just misplaced this page for a while and realized it was there and went, crap, we got to get that into that book.
Yeah.
Give it to Bill. Get it to Bill. So I don't know. All I can point to is that note, but it sure is interesting as a thing. There's also a couple of little changes that are important here. There is a border note from Stan to Steve. Typically, the way they would work in these days is, they would talk over a story. Ditko would go back to his studio, pencil the story, bring it in. He would go over it panel by panel with Stan, and Stan would suggest changes or ask for things. They weren't always written on the boards because these guys would talk to one another, but in this case, a bunch of them were. And here, there is a note instructing Steve in the second panel that says, Steve, change to wheat cakes. So what this means is that, as originally drawn, Aunt May was serving something else for breakfast beyond wheat cakes. And this moment changed the entire history of comics, as wheat cakes are indelibly now associated with the origin of Spider-Man. Why did they change it? What was it originally? What foodstuff could Aunt May have been serving that morning? I don't know. There's not enough evidence there to tell, but for now and forevermore, it's going to be wheat cakes. There's also some very minor lettering corrections in panel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 4. Panel 4, where Pete asks Sally for the date, and she tells him for the umpteenth time, no. Umpteenth was a change. That originally there was a different word there, probably just a different number. Right. For the last time or for the 7th time or whatever, and Stan changed it because umpteenth is funnier. Also in panel 5, that's Sally cozying up to Flash Thompson, but it sure looks a lot like what Betty Brant would look like about a year later. So that was a very very typical Ditko character design. She's got Betty's short curly haircut that she had at the beginning, and if you pull just that face out, she looks like Betty Brant.
My favorite design on this page is Flash Thompson with a big T on his
I was just about to say,
right.
is that the style at the time? Is that like wearing an onion on your belt or something, or what?
It was T for Midtown High, of course.
Oh, okay.
This is the equivalent of wearing the rock concert shirt or the band shirt to the rock concert, but we all know Flash is always throwing a rock concert for himself. So
again, I think this is more a throwback to an earlier period. Like, if you look at the Archie comics of this period and the periods right before, like Reggie and Jughead and even Archie are often wearing sweaters or sweater vests that have a letter on it, the R for Riverdale or the M for Mantle or whatever. And that was, I think, a throwback to the way high school kids dressed in the 40s. So Flash is a little old for his age here in 1962, rocking his strange, I don't know what it stands for, T-shirt. But everybody in this story is sort of attired in a way that's a little bit older than the year in which it was published.
We've also got the introduction of Aunt May and Uncle Ben. There's an earlier issue, I believe, of Amazing Fantasy where like two characters named Aunt May and Uncle Ben show up. Do you believe that this is just kind of like I can reuse those names and no one will notice kind of thing?
Well, it's not even so much no one will notice. That was an issue of Strange Tales. It was Strange Tales 97. I wrote about that story as well. And it's just these were names that Stan liked and used a lot. Spider-Man has an Uncle Ben. The Rawhide Kid has an Uncle Ben. Both of them are killed. Coincidence? or pattern. Serial killer? Who can say? But, these were things, and these were sort of types. And if you look at them in that story, that Uncle Ben has a mustache, although in recent reprintings they've tended to color over it to make him look more like it's not. And that Aunt May was just another sort of, elderly, 60s going on the grave woman. So these were just kind of characters and types. The names weren't necessarily important. And even here, I think, while they knew Spider-Man was going to be a strip, nobody was attaching any particular importance to this. He's got these relatives, Uncle Ben and Aunt May. Ben Grimm is in the Fantastic Four, introduced only 6, 7, 8 months before. These were names that, for whatever reason, Stan liked the sound of and would use over and over again. Also, those wheat cakes must be pretty great because it looks like Uncle Ben gains about 50 pounds between panel 1 and panel 2. He is super gaunt in that first panel, and by panel 2, he's more the huskier guy that we tend to recognize as Uncle Ben there. So the wheat cakes, or whatever Aunt May secretly prepared before the art change, they did the trick. She knows her stuff around the kitchen.
I mean, there might have just been some whey protein so he could out wrestle Peter finally, because clearly he was concerned about that.
Yeah.
I'm now imagining a big blockbuster movie with Peter and the Rawhide Kid, where they're fighting and they both realize that they have aunts and uncles named May and Ben, and decide forever truce. All right, let's move on to page 3. Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about that page?
Absolutely. So Peter here is attending that demonstration of where he's seeing the radioactive rays zapping a spider. And then, of course, immediately after this experiment, he's gripping his hand in pain because the spider has bitten him as it glows and then dies off. Actually, it goes off to bite Cindy Moon, but that's another story. Peter immediately feels faint and leaves the exhibit. He gets outside and feels like his whole body has, quote unquote, been charged with some kind of energy. We even get the big, scary, amazing adult fantasy hands going with it. He then suddenly leaps out of the way of an oncoming car towards the side of a nearby building. So, again, it's this... It's 8 panels, lots happening here, lots of dialogue, lots of action. Tom, what don't we know about here?
Well, a couple of things. In panel 6, the third panel in the middle tier, where Peter is reacting to having been bitten, and you can still see on the original art, if you zoom in closely enough and pop the gain up far enough, there's still enough pencil there. There's a note in the border from Stan saying, "Steve, remove spider, change position of hand." Peter's got his right hand up to his head, but he originally had his left hand still in the shot, still upraised, and still holding the spider, and they took that out. Also, in the last panel on this page, when Ditko originally drew it, that car was a convertible, and there was a guy reaching out and gestating. And there's a note there from Stan that says, "Steve, make this a covered sedan. No arms hanging out. Don't imply wild, reckless driving."
Was that a particular concern of Steve's or Stan's?
Well, again, you never knew what the comics code was going to object to.
Yeah, true.
Particularly anything that was duplicable behavior. And so, again, I don't know that this was the most important thing in the world, and I don't know that it's anything that they thought terribly deeply about. This was just part of the process. Ditko brought in the page. Stan said, "That looks, dangerous, like they're on a weird joyride or something. They should just be ordinary people." And Peter happens to wander out in front of them, and he jumps out of the way. It's not meant to imply that they're doing anything wrong. The person at fault here is Peter for having sort of heedlessly stumbled out of the place and into the road without looking. So they changed it for the final page.
Yeah, I buy that change. I mean, I feel like it kind of lends itself more to the surprise element, at least from Peter. He was just kind of daydreaming and oh, I got to jump. I mean, kind of like what we saw and what we see in the movies when they kind of manifest this scene. But yeah.
Yeah, panel 7 to me, every time I look at it, always reads like Peter's stomach is honking at him. That he's desperately hungry or something, because those horn sounds don't really read like they're coming from some. I don't know where I would have put them to make them read better that there's a car coming at him, but they just seem to radiate from his stomach. So
more wheat cakes. I mean, like it's
it's been a page. Gotta get back to Queens.
Don't tell Dan Slott about that. He'll invent some universe where Spider-Man's powers are that his stomach honks. That'll be the next thing we get. All right, great. I've always loved this page, and I specifically panels 3 and 4, the kind of inversion of the inks there, with the kind of sell us on the shock of the spider, and the kind of singling out of Peter from the crowd. Those ones have always been very striking to me. Not to mention the abnormally sized hands that are found throughout. But yeah. Anyway, let's move on.
It's also a patently ridiculous sequence, and you can tell by how often people who have either retold it or adapted it for other media have had to kind of explain this. They've got a huge cyclotron projecting radioactive rays safely without any enclosure, without so open that a spider can just drop down from the ceiling, get into it, and then jump onto a guy who happens to be in the crowd. It's very much like the 1962 version of radioactivity in the Marvel comics of that period, which were all very much developed during that Cold War era and under the constant specter of the atomic bomb. They kind of used radioactivity as magic. Anytime they needed some fantastic thing to happen, it would always be radioactivity. And so here, it's, pretty much the spider crawls into a bunch of magic and then magics to Peter Parker to make him magic.
60 Spider-Man comics or just Marvel comics in general might as well be a PSA for reckless science. Anyway, let's move on to page 4, everybody. So page 4, Peter climbs the wall of a building with his bare hands after narrowly avoiding the car. He crutches a steel pipe as though it were paper. He walks or crawls effortlessly down a thin cable and ultimately concludes, as you would, that somehow the spider bite transferred its powers to him. Seeking a way to test his powers, Peter discovers a contest to stay in a wrestling ring with a muscular Crusher Hogan and decides he'll enter, but only with a disguise, lest he fail and be humiliated. Tom, what don't we know about this page?
Well, just casually, since you bring it up here, Hogan is another one of those names that Stan liked a lot and used a lot. Happy Hogan is probably the longest gestating version of that, but there are any number of earlier one-off fantasy stories and weird stories, or westerns even, that people would often fight, Killer Hogan or whatever. It was a name that sounded good, so Crusher Hogan is that. There's not that much on this page that's not obvious in the original art. There is a note from Stan about panel 5, which says, Steve, make this a gloomy back alley so no one can see him as he, traverses that line. I guess maybe in the pencils, that building that Peter is descending from was not a silhouette, was open, and you might think, oh, maybe if somebody was in those buildings, they'd see this kid rappelling down on the line and be able to realize that he was Spider-Man. There's also some really nice, very simple, very basic cartooning and acting on this page. I think the figure of Peter getting to the top of the building and crushing the pipe in panel 3 is really nicely done. I think the composition of panel 2, that upshot with the tiny little Peter silhouette in the distance and that weird kid who at least in one retelling gets smacked for telling his mom he sees a guy climbing up the wall. That's wonderfully framed. And the 6th panel is sort of quintessentially Ditko as well, with the sort of heavily shadowed Peter, walking off into the distance with the spider web and the spider in the foreground, encompassing him and almost enveloping him like fate or destiny. Again, this is still relatively proto-Ditko in terms of doing superhero stuff, but his storytelling and design chops are right on point.
I do find it interesting from the Twilight Zone kind of point of view here, that and again, as an aversion of superhero comics, that his first choice when he has these powers and he recognizes he has these powers is, how can I make money with them? I mean, I don't think you probably saw that before in a superhero comic until
No, definitely not. And again, this story really owes a lot of itself, as you say, to those one-off fantasy stories that these guys were doing. In a very real way, this could have just been another issue of Amazing Adult Fantasy. It's just that the kid doesn't become a superhero. He becomes whatever. He wanders off into the night at the end, and there is no follow-up story. It's a one-off story. It definitely trades on that sort of recurring theme of somebody who lucks into some power and ability and misuses it and gets their comeuppance by the end in a ironic twist of fate. So it's using all of those tools and all of those dramatic structures that they had developed over years doing fantasy stories, just for a continuing character and in a superhero style context for the first time.
I've always wondered the implication of the final panel with Peter leaving his glasses behind. Was he fighting Crusher blind in some way, or were the glasses only ever just a fashion statement for Peter in some way? Because we know.
I don't know. I always assume that the glasses were real, and that his vision did clear up after getting bitten by the spider, in the sense of everything else. It is, symbolically sort of like, I'm leaving my current identity behind and becoming this new person or this new persona. Some of it is just practical. You can't put the glasses on under or over that mask and take them into a wrestling ring. You're gonna bust them. So some of that is just that. How he gets from the house to the wrestling field in that costume without any glasses is a really good question. And I don't have an answer. I see him on the Long Island Railroad coming in from Queens, strap hanging, wearing his bandana mask and his old overalls or whatever, going, what stop is this? But it's again, it's all part and parcel. I will say that panel too of Peter kind of shrugging on the big oversized sweatsuit, again, some really nice character acting there, for all that it's a still panel. You really get the sense of him shucking this thing on.
And his face immediately looks more heroic. I mean, you start getting the kind of like Superman like curl in the hair there that isn't present anywhere else, where he has like the kind of widow's peak. Maybe you can clear this up for me, and maybe not. I'm curious. In the 1967 cartoon, there's an additional sequence during this part of the story where Peter fights a bunch of like thugs or bullies that then shows up again in later retelling of this during one of the anniversary stories. And like, there's no room for it, but it's just a strange addition that showed up there and was later kind of added in a kind of slightly elongated version of this tale. Do you know any history behind that sequence, or?
I know the first place it showed up was in the first real retelling of Spider-Man's full origin, which was in the first issue of the Black and White magazine, Spectacular Spider-Man, I think that was 1968. And that was Stan and Larry Lieber, and I don't think Johnny inked it. I think maybe Jim Mooney or somebody inked it. John was busy working on the lead story. And it was taking effectively this 11-page story and expanding it to, I don't remember how many pages it was, 12 or 15, and changing it up to make it more in line with what Spider-Man was at that point. So I think that's simply Stan coming up with another bit of business to help flesh out the story, or Larry when he was drawing it, so Peter doesn't immediately segue from he's out in the world and he goes home. He has this encounter, with these goons on the street, and I think he swings and breaks a lamppost with them. So clearly they're going to have no idea that he's Spider-Man. But it's another bit of color, another bit of business, and maybe there was a concern that, it's too many pages of guys just standing around. We need some action here, in a way that they weren't as concerned about that here, because that hadn't really become the formula yet. This is really paced and framed like one of those fantasy stories rather than a superhero story. And then it got adapted that way. They used that version of the Spider-Man origin as the basis for the 67 cartoon episode that adapted the origin, which I think also first aired in 68 or maybe 69, that particular episode. And so that was all taken from that backup story. So presumably when Ralph Bakshi or whomever said, hey, we want to do the origin of Spider-Man, and they gave them reference on it, it was that story, which was contemporary and fresh, that they gave them, not Amazing Fantasy 15.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for clearing that up for me. Mark, do you want to turn the page to page 5?
Absolutely. So now we see Peter approaching Crusher Hogan with dreams of winning that prize money. He's elusive, dodging all of Crusher's attacks and then jumping over him. Peter realizes at this moment that he indeed has the proportionate speed and strength of a spider. Crusher believes someone who moves like him, quote, can't be human. Meanwhile, a gentleman looks on, overhearing other spectators talk about this being the greatest act they've ever seen, and this man thinks to himself that this is the quote-unquote character that he has been looking for. Tom, what do we got here that might not be seen by the naked eye?
Well, on the original art in the last panel, it is clear that the second balloon that's in that panel, the one talking about sensational, fantastic, that was originally lettered at the upper right and was going to Maxie the agent. And they decided at some point, whether, I can't tell from this and from what's here, whether that was just a mistake that Art Simic made when he was lettering this, like he thought it was that guy's balloon and realized, oh no, there's a third balloon that goes to that guy, I got to move it. But that balloon gets whited out, and the replacement balloon where Maxie's thinking about, that's the guy, the kind of guy I've been looking for, that's lettered over top of it. Also, super minor thing, but on the art, you can see in the pencils that in panel 4, there were a couple of lines in the background there denoting, like the back and side of the wrestling ring that Ditko just left out, chose not to add in when he was inking and finalizing that panel, simplifying the composition so it's a little easier to follow.
That's such a great panel, though. I mean, it's such clean action.
Yeah, I like the very simplified face on Crusher Hogan in all of these panels. He really has no neck at all in panel 1, but he's got that delightful cherubic smiling face, and weird Ditko proportions in panel 2. Like he's built oddly and sort of scarecrowly. But again, there's some nice vibe here. And the little makeshift mask that Peter wears is kind of fun. And so like this is it's a classic sequence for a reason. And it really all just sort of works. I mean, and even the introduction of Maxie, like in that panel, if you're just looking at the visuals with his, pork pie hat and his big cigar, you can look at that guy and go, he's an agent.
Yep.
He's an agent. He's going to sign
up. A Star
up.
is born.
Right. But you just get it. Like everybody is a type here. Yeah. And you can look at even just like the other people that are in the crowd at the wrestling ring, and there's a guy in a hat and a guy in like an old school cap and another guy with a cigarette, and like they immediately become personalities. They're not just they're generic people, but they're not generic. Like Ditko hasn't just drawn 4 of the same face. He's drawn a whole bunch of different guys that all have some little bit of personality to them that make them a little more distinguished than just a bunch of random heads in the background.
Can I ask about the mask itself? I mean, the hatching on it looks like it's a different kind of like, it's not as dark as the other inks on the page. Is that still just pencil that has been scanned darkly on there, or?
No, that's just line control. It's just a thinner, slimmer line. Ditko is good enough, at his line control. It may be too that most of this looks like it was inked with a brush, and he may have done those they're not quite web lines, those hatch lines, with a pen to get a finer, more controlled line on them. But looking at the original art, those are equally dark, equally India ink as everything else around it. I don't just think they weren't done with a brush.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it just seems like it almost seems like a more modern kind of like pattern you would cut out and put on there than like a fine thing. But yeah, I totally believe you.
All right, Dan, let's take a quick pause here, regrettably, so we could talk about one of our favorite things, the Slack. Hundreds of listeners like you hang out in our community of Spider-Man fans on Slack. The amazing Spider Slack community is absolutely free to join, and you could jump into active conversations with awesome people about collecting, conventions, movies, new comics, old comics, and more. Dan, even I was there about a week ago, but I was there. I did it.
I was thrilled to see you, Mark, and I hope you come back soon because it's
a really great
place. Great. I know everybody was thrilled to see you there. This week's been fun because we've been talking about all the D23 announcements. We got a couple of like new trailers and things. I'm really excited about Werewolf by Night just because it looks like something really different from Marvel. A little bit less thrilled with the Thunderbolts lineup in that it's just like a who's who of super soldiers, but maybe there's a couple of aces up their sleeve they're trying to keep hidden. But yeah, I don't know, Mark, did you watch any of the D23 stuff?
I just saw the announcements via Twitter. I didn't see the actual. I mean, I saw some of the trailers and stuff, but I didn't watch the live stream or anything. But yeah, I'm with you on the Thunderbolts. I was excited about the Secret Invasion trailer. I too am intrigued by Werewolf by Night. So yeah, content, Dan. Whether you like it or not, it's coming.
Yeah, well, the emphasis on like it or not. So, yeah, if you want to join our awesome Spider-Man community, you can just follow the link in the description to this episode and be sure to say hi. We get a bunch of people that ghost join and they never say anything. And I'm like, okay, you went through all the steps of joining. Who are you? And it makes me a little paranoid because, after the whole Norman Osborn incident, I'm extra cautious about people engaging with me silently on social media. But yeah, come on and say hi. And you can even let us know what you thought of this episode with Tom Brevoort. We're having a blast recording it, and we hope you guys enjoyed as much as we do making it.
Absolutely.
Page 6, Peter is approached by the TV producer who offers to book him on the Ed Sullivan Show. Back home, Peter designs his own Spider-Man costume and web shooters, which we see for the very first time, excluding that little figure up at the top of page 1. Fully suited, he tests them out and pulls himself up to cling to the ceiling of his room. Determined as ever, Peter announces that the world is about to meet Spider-Man. What don't we know about this page?
Not too much. I mean, the one big observation here is Spider-Man is still one word, and apparently when Ditko created the costume, his sense of the color scheme for it, he wanted it to be, in essence, orange and purple. And in fact, in the early Spider-Man comics, those blue areas are more often colored in a dark blue verging on purple. If you look at the original printing of Amazing Fantasy 15, as opposed to a lot of the reprintings that have tended to skew it more blue, because those historically are what Spider-Man's colors are. The dark areas, the purple areas, are really supposed to be black. Ditko is doing them as a shiny black, and you can see in a bunch of the panels on this page, they're full on black, they're completely full or almost completely full, except for maybe a little bit of edge lighting. Some later creators like Eric Larson would almost always do these areas solid black when he was drawing Spider-Man. So that costume was meant to be orange and black rather than red and blue.
Any insights on the fact that we get the web wings? Obviously, now the original Ditko cover doesn't have the web wings, and that was done after, right? So I'm just kind of curious where that's all coming from. Because obviously the Kirby one had it, but
some of that is just practicality, and you can see it, in the issues that Ditko does. He keeps the underarm webbing there relatively consistently, but not all the time. In part because it gets in the way. Both of those covers involve both carrying a guy under your arm,
Right.
which is definitely going to get in the way of that underarm webbing. And then on the Ditko one, he's got his other arm almost straight up as they're swinging. And so trying to even figure out what that would look like that web, underarm web pattern would be stretched so vertically. Like, what would you even see? I think it would just be distracting there. It is one of those classic Spider-Man elements that it doesn't make a whit of sense. And it couldn't possibly work the way it's depicted here. But it looks cool, and I prefer the Spider-Man design with the underarm webs to not. But I understand why they often get dropped. It's just they're not at all practical. I also love the idea that Peter Parker's webbing has some like strong rubber cement on the end of it, so he can pull himself up. And those early like web shooters look like he's got like rubber tennis balls or something on his palms. Like these are all very crude.
Yeah, I was always taken by two panels on this page. The first one being panel number 2 with Uncle Ben and Aunt May, if only because like secret identity is not really a strong feature of this issue. There's not really a reason for him to hide from his parents or aunt and uncle, not really. Yet the way that it's drawn, his back turned to them and him kind of almost secreting this mask, to me is like almost an early genesis of that idea.
Well, definitely. I mean, it's a complete contrivance, and it's one that, again, most other adaptations have had to find their way to work around, because the reason it works here is you immediately cut from Peter in the wrestling costume to Peter at home secretly making this thing, to then later in the story Peter going out and appearing in public on television and so forth. And there is literally no reason in the world he should not tell his parents and guardians what has happened to him and where he's going, except by the end of the story he's going to be a superhero, so he can't. Yeah. And Stan and Steve just dodge around that by not letting you stare at it too much. Also, Aunt May has apparently been eating the wheat cakes herself, because she is much stockier here and seems much more youthful than she was only a couple of pages ago.
This isn't an Aunt May who has a heart attack every other page.
No, she's an Aunt May who gives a heart attack. She's constantly giving people food. Here, have some crackers, have some milk, have some wheat cakes. Eat, boy, eat.
And then panel 4 it was always been interesting to me for Peter's kind of like wicked smile. You've got this kind of like more friendly, heroic looking Peter on panel 2, presenting himself to his aunt and uncle, but then there's this kind of like wicked, devilish joy on panel 4 that I've always particularly enjoyed.
Yeah, I like the way that the two intersecting web lines become like a little tiny little web. Like they've got connections in between them. They're not just like two strings that cross in an X, that somehow they become a more complex web at the point in which they intersect. Again, doesn't make a whit of sense in real life, but it looks cool, and if it looks cool, it is cool.
Is that a hard rule at Marvel?
I don't know if it's a hard rule. It's certainly my rule. If it looks good, it is good.
Yeah.
Great. I love it. Mark, why don't you tell us about page 7, also known as page 8?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wonder, Tom, if you'll have anything on that. But in page 8, this is the first page of part 2. Spider-Man, still no hyphen, is performing for the cameras on the Ed Sullivan Show. The cameraman and the studio crew are looking on, and they are gobsmacked, completely amazed by what they're seeing, and perhaps also a little terrified, some of the audience at least. Spider-Man uses his web shooters to spin a web for the audience, doing these like little parlor tricks. The producer tells him to save some of his tricks for a future show and leave them wanting more.
Okay,
so, Tom,
well,
what do we got here?
To answer your first question about page 8, yes, in the original art, outside of the board, this is numbered as page 8, whereas the previous page was page 6. And the reason for that is those are not actual page numbers. Those are what we call lineup numbers. And what that means is when you're putting together a comic book or a magazine, you must account for every page, and that includes the pages that have advertising on them. So the page between that previous page and this first part of chapter 2 was an ad, and you can confirm that by looking at an actual copy of Amazing Fantasy 15.
Let me just get my 2 extras over here. No.
So that's, again, it's one of those things that people have asked about frequently when looking at copies of the original art, but that's why it's the way it is. There's an ad in between those two. Interestingly, at least to me, in this first appearance, the spider symbol on Spider-Man's back is colored blue in this original story and not red. And in fact, looking at the original art, the way Ditko does it is he leaves just a circle on the back and then goes in with some whiteout and draws the legs and the little head at the top of it separately. That's very clear if you're looking at the original art. And in panel 3, in the pencils, there's a bunch of erased attempts by Ditko to get Spider-Man's left hand into just the right weird position to be zapping that web line across. So he was still, trial and erroring his way through how to make that work. And you can see he drew it 2 or 3 times before settling on the one he actually inked. Also, for to no great surprise, at the top of the board, written in Ditko's handwriting, although it's been largely erased now, it says "Amazing 15 Spider-Man," all one word, Part 2 Ditko. So, he's just labeling his page, but it's definitely the start of Part 2.
I've always appreciated like the kind of like how much we just jump straight into Spider-Man doing really weird poses, as this character, and it makes him very distinct, I think. And, I think it shows great care from Ditko that he was trying to do something unusual with this guy.
For sure. Although there's no question in that splash page, Spider-Man's right leg is completely broken at the knee. Like a human leg does not turn that way at the knee, regardless of how spidery you might be. And I suspect, again, just looking at that figure, I suspect that he adjusted it that way so as to not crop it at the top. Because, to give the impression of a guy sticking to the wall, you want to see the whole of the figure in the image and not have any part extend beyond the border, because maybe he's hanging up on something. Maybe there's something holding him up. You can imagine that the situation is different, but that's a weird looking position for that leg, especially when you look at it up close. It is exactly what Ditko drew. Nobody, funked with it or changed it after the fact. But, it's odd. And so, this is really the first quintessential Spider-Man pose that you can't really duplicate in real life with your action figures or, God forbid, your human body.
Can I ask you, there is, in both the print and original art, there is this number and letter combo of V-789. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I do. That is a job number. And what that is because all of these books, even before the superhero days, they were mostly anthology titles, and they mostly had multiple stories in each title. So even if you had an issue of Patsy Walker, in the average Patsy Walker issue, you would get 2 or 3 or 4 Patsy Walker stories, or maybe one of them would be dedicated to Chili, her rival, or whatever. The way they dealt with accounting on these things and kept track of all the stories and where they were is every story when it was started was assigned a job number. At this point, we're in the middle of the V series. They went from V001 to V999 and then went up to the next letter, which would have been presumably W, although I know that they may have skipped W because it's too easy to confuse a W with a V, so they may have gone straight to X. I know there's a lot of X numbers. So that's just the job number for this particular story. And if you look at the other stories in Amazing Fantasy 15, they all have job numbers that are fairly concurrent. I don't know what they are precisely off the top of my head, but I would guess that one of them is V790 and V791, because that was the order in which they were either written or drawn, and that's how they existed on Marvel's books, to make sure that when the work was done on them, they got paid for.
You hear that, collectors? You can get V800, and it's worth a lot. All right, Mark, let's turn the page then and talk about page number 9.
All right, Dan, let us
also
hear about it.
Also known as page number 8. Peter is hounded by producers as he leaves the stage, but backstage, a thief runs past him, chased by a police officer. Peter lets him pass, and he escapes into the elevator. The cop chastises Peter, who tells him that it isn't his job to stop thieves, that he only looks out for himself. Back at home, Peter is gifted a microscope by his aunt and uncle and thinks to himself that no one else matters, just himself and his family. Tom, what do you know about this page that we don't know before we talk about it generally?
Well, there's a big change that was made on this page between the pencils and the inks, and that is that what is currently panel 4 here was a completely different panel at one point, and was changed. But before we get to that, in panel 2, there's a note from Stan to Steve, and the entirety of the note I couldn't decipher. I could just get most of it. So it reads, "Steve, this something, no sense to be happy, brackets, without any smiling." So it seems like, when the burglar, the crook, is running away from the cop, in Ditko's original pencils, he was smiling like, "Haha, I'm getting away from this guy." And Stan felt like that didn't make any sense. He's being chased by the cop. He's not that far ahead. Don't make him smiling. But in addition, next to panel 3, there's an erased note from Stan that reads, "Steve, omit crook, show door slamming." So what Stan wanted was that third panel to not have the burglar there at all, not to see him, but to just have the elevator door closed already at that point. And then the fourth panel, and there's no note about this, but having boosted the gain up, I've been able to see evidence of the erased pencils. There's a panel with the guard running up and confronting Spider-Man, who has his back to the camera. You can really see the head of the guard most clearly of the stuff that you could make out at that point. So this confrontation that Spider-Man has with the elderly guard when it was penciled was 3 panels long. And at some point, because clearly in panel 3, Ditko didn't make the door closed and didn't get rid of the guy, he and Stan must have talked further about this page and what was required. And so they tweaked the expression on the burglar's face in panel 2 to make him not smiling. They show him still in the elevator with the closing doors in panel 3, and Ditko adds a new panel, which is a close-up on the smiling burglar who has now gotten away, presumably a way of going, well, he's happy that he eluded a capture, and that was a point that for whatever reason Ditko felt was important. So you lose one panel of the tired guard coming up to Spider-Man, who's just standing there with his chin hanging out. And that's, that's it. So this looks like a page that was conceived exactly this way, but in fact, it was slightly different when it started.
Tom, obviously a lot over the years has been made about Ditko's, philosophy, if you will. We really don't truly get it in this comic until this page, I feel like. I feel like this is kind of like the objectivism on full display here. Both Spider-Man's initial nonchalance about, that's not my job, that's your job, but then also the last 2 panels with him and Ben and May being like, well, nothing else matters except for us. So, to your knowledge with, Ditko and Lee, did that kind of did Ditko's philosophy kind of come out in the comics prior to this, or was this kind of maybe a trial? Again, seeing himself as the character, an
Right.
opportunity to kind of get that out there.
At this point, and I couldn't tell you with any certainty exactly when Ditko began to become influenced by the philosophical teachings that clearly became his lighthouse in later years. I don't think you really start to see evidence of them in his work until later than this. So while I think you can definitely sort of project those ideas onto this scene, I don't know that anything that complex was going through either man's mind. I think this is a simple morality tale. In fact,
Yeah.
years later, there was a point in the 90s when, for a brief second, it looked like Ralph Macchio was going to get Ditko and Stan to do one last new Spider-Man story together. And Ralph had known Ditko for years, and they talked and worked together and so forth. And they talked about Spider-Man a little bit, in preparation for this thing. And one of Ditko's observations about this is, left to his own devices, he never would have had Spider-Man graduate high school, because in his estimation, it's okay for a teenager, for a kid, to make mistakes and to do the wrong thing and to mess up. And that's forgivable because a kid is still learning and figuring out his place and so forth. Once he gets to a certain age, once he becomes a functional adult, he must, talk the talk and walk the walk as an adult does. And so, in Ditko's mind, once you get Peter Parker to the point where he's in college, it's no longer okay for him to screw up in the way he screws up here and the way he screws up in so many stories. At that point, he's not just a kid learning; he's a foul up adult who's not able to take care of himself. So I think that there's a little bit of that here. This is almost more. I mean, some of it is just the simple morality tale of, this is the turn point. Kid gets the powers. Kid uses the powers selfishly. Kid refuses to do an altruistic act. Kid pays the price for that. Through a twist of fate, kid learns lesson. That's the simplest version of the Spider-Man story. So, what this is definitely that. Could that undercurrent have been there? For sure. Ditko certainly felt strongly about some of these beliefs later in life, and I don't know when he began to read and absorb and make them a part of his personal ethos. He may have been influenced by those thoughts and those philosophers at this point, and it may, as you say, be a part of what's going on here. But again, to some degree, you also have to think about these pages without the copy, because the copy is what Stan is adding, and there's nothing necessarily in the visuals that say, I'm going to take care of Aunt May and Uncle Ben and screw the rest of the world. That's the way Stan interpolates what the visuals are telling us. What's there on the page is simply Spider-Man lets the guy get away. He goes back home, and his parental figures have this gift of this microscope for him, and he's happy, and they love him, and he's on top of the world, and everything is great. So that context could definitely have been something, and probably was something, that to some degree Lee and Ditko discussed. But the way it's expressed here, it's entirely dialogue, so most of that probably leans more heavily on Stan.
All right, well, let's turn the page to page 10. Mark, tell us what happens on page 10.
Yeah, well, the newspaper headlines say it all. Spider-Man is a sensation. We get like a little mini montage in a panel here showing that. But Peter gets home from a gig one night and sees a police car in front of his house. He asks the cop what's going on, and the cop breaks the dramatic news very bluntly. His uncle was killed by a burglar. He surprised him. The cops are holding off the burglar at the Acme warehouse while Aunt May is at a neighbor's house. Peter knows a burglar could hold off a small army in that warehouse, so he gets into his Spider-Man costume and is committed to bring him to justice. Big scene here, Tom. What's happening that we may not know about?
On this page, absolutely nothing. what you see is pretty much what you get. There's nothing on the original art that indicates any particular changes or tweaks or whatever. It is worth noting that first panel here which has 4 separate headlines. And granted, they're from different fictitious newspapers, so maybe they could all have been a reference to the same event. But this certainly implies that Spider-Man, even apart from the TV appearance we've already seen, does at least 5 gigs, 5 jobs as a performer before this point and before Uncle Ben is killed. And that means there's a bunch of questions, at least in my head. One, eventually in Amazing Spider-Man 1, Stan and Steve do the kind of fun gag where they pay Spider-Man by check and he can't cash the check because he can't prove he's Spider-Man. But he's done 5 gigs here. Where's the money? What's he doing with it? I assume the web fluid costs a certain amount, but like, how is this? He's not doing this for free. Clearly, he's getting paid for all of these television appearances and public appearances. Where is the money? 2, even if these are daily events, he does 1 show every day. It's been at least a week. He's a TV star. He still hasn't told, forget about his agent, he hasn't told his Aunt May or Uncle Ben about any of this stuff. They're scraping together pennies to buy him a microscope, and he's living large somewhere. He's got some Walter White style storage facility that he's stacking bundles of dollar bills up in while they're struggling at the house. Like, again, it's this way because it's a superhero origin. He needs to keep his identity a secret. They know that that's where they're going, and so they just kind of slough past it. And you don't really think about it too much in reading this. It's a montage panel. But, looking back at it, it's kind of like, none of that really makes a lot of sense. And this is also why, when you get to things like, the first Spider-Man movie, like they make a very clever adjustment in that, which is, the burglar gets away from Spider-Man and, shoots Uncle Ben while Ben's waiting to pick Peter up in the car downstairs. So you lose all that time in between. It's literally much more immediately set up punchline. And there's a reason why Uncle Ben is there. He's there to pick up Peter, who's taken and dropped off at the thing, not necessarily knowing he's going to the wrestling thing. He's thinks he's going to the public library or whatever. But it avoids all of the questions that naturally arise in this story. But in a superhero comic of 1962, this was far from the least plausible thing that would routinely happen. So, you kind of can just go by it, but it's fun sometimes to stare at this stuff and go, and none of these newspapers spell his name right. None of them have a dash. So he's not enforcing his trademark. Clearly none of them are by J. Jonah Jameson. That's right. Held to a higher journalistic standard, like JJ.
Tom, I'm going to pitch you Amazing Spider-Man 1000 right now because he's got that money stashed in the Acme warehouse. And by a twist of fate, he wasn't actually intending to stop the burglar. He was trying to cash out and was forced into this heroic role.
In my head, every time I read that, I envision the warehouse that's got all of the weird high-tech gizmos
and contraptions
that Wile E. Coyote orders to try and capture and kill the Roadrunner.
Let me get my magnet and roller skates.
The burglar should have just grabbed something from one of the crates and skated. It would have been pretty easy.
Can we talk about this creepy floating head of Spider-Man in the upper right-hand corner of this page that is always like very much unnerved me? It's not necessary at all for the page, and yet like I can't help but feel stylistic flourish from Steve Ditko there.
Sure. Honestly, the odd thing about that is that he gives him the indication of the nose. Like, you're not used to seeing that on a Spider-Man head. And so just that little thing, that little shadow, changes the expression on that face. It's no longer just the eyes that make up the expression. It's the eyes and that hint of a nose. And it looks weird. And part of the reason it looks weird is they haven't figured out what the iconography of Spider-Man is going to be yet. All through this story, they manipulate that mask in ways whenever they need it for effect. And this is kind of one of those times. Like, it adds that little thing. It gives him a slightly different expression than you would have if you took it out and it was just a Spidey head there. He'd have a little less expressiveness to himself.
Well, they can't even figure out like how many pieces his costume is, because on panel 6 on this page, you've got the mask attached to the suit, whereas at the end of the comic, he clearly can take the mask clean off to reveal his face. So,
well, presumably, you can do it in different parts. You can detach the mask at the neck, but you can also attach it at the neck so it's seamless, and the shirt comes down over the tights. Where he'll eventually put the belt of web cartridges. But yeah, they weren't worried about being consistent with that sort of stuff. They just did it. I think if you scroll back to whatever is page 5 or page 6 when he's first putting the costume together, like the mask is clearly in his hand. It's a separate piece.
right.
But here it functions like the mask in the '77 Japanese TV show, where you pretty much had a zipper across the back web pattern, and the actor could pull the mask off, but it was all attached to the onesie.
And it shoots out of your wrist in one piece.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so let's move on to page 11, the penultimate page of this tale. Peter shoots a web at a nearby lamppost and web slings for the first time. He arrives at the warehouse where the cops are mulling over how to apprehend the burglar. Spidey slips in and surprises him from above, scaring the man and sending him fleeing. Tom, anything special going on in this page?
Again, nothing special here. What you see is very much what you get. That first panel in panel 2 of Spider-Man swinging, it's a really awkward looking panel. And in some ways that's appropriate because, it's the first time he's done it and he's a kid and so forth. But you can see Ditko hasn't worked out what this looks like yet. And he'll just get better and more adept at that as he goes along and figures out what works and what doesn't. But looking back at it, it's a really weird looking frame.
Well, I've always liked that in the second panel, you can see the remnants of whatever that post is that's sticking out of the building. It's still there. So there is the kind of early implication that he could transfer from line to line midair. Yeah.
Of course, then by panel 5, we do get a quintessential Spider-Man pose in terms of him scaling down the side of the wall, approaching the burglar. I mean, and it seems like Ditko got the physics of it a little bit better than he did earlier with his leg kind of clanging in a weird direction. So, I just love that.
Panel 6 is an interesting choice too, because Ditko kind of like throws away the whole right quarter of that panel. It's all just the silhouette of the wall. And to get that diagonal so that you understand that it's a wall and not a panel border or something. But that's like a really weird shot to see somebody at, that down shot where you're kind of looking under his ribs and through his arms, and the burglar is down below him. Again, those are sort of the kind of images. It's particularly effective coming after the previous panel, which was an upshot, a worm's eye shot. Camera set up beneath the burglar and looking up past him at Spider-Man on the wall. So again, these are very dramatic and interesting choices, and you wouldn't see panels framed that way in any other strip. Like no other character moved like this, even in this first story. You can't find a Green Lantern story where he's posed anything like this, or a panel is framed in that way, or a Flash story or a Hawkman story. They just don't exist.
I've always appreciated the geography of this scene too. Like, it's very clear despite the strange angles that you're talking about. Enough that when Sam Raimi reproduced it, it's almost like framed exactly the same way, in that he's above the burglar, he leaps over him. It's very clear on the page like how this physically is playing out, and it's something that I think Ditko is usually pretty good at with his action sequences.
I would agree.
Hot
All
take,
right.
Dan.
Well, if there's if there's nothing else to say about this one, why don't we move to maybe the most important page of this comic, page 12. Mark, tell us about page 12.
Yes, well, Spider-Man corners the burglar using his web to disarm his gun and then lets his fist do the rest. But after landing the decisive blow, he recognizes the face of the burglar. It's the fugitive who ran past him at the television studio, the one Peter didn't stop when he had the chance. Meanwhile, the cops are getting ready to give up when the burglar is delivered to them out of the window on a spider's web. Tear-stricken Peter bemoans that his uncle's death is all his fault. He then slinks off into the quiet of the night while the narrator opines those famous words, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility." Then a teaser at the bottom of the page promises more of this, quote, teenage idol, with a hyphen, in the next issue of Amazing Fantasy. So we probably have about 3, all-time iconic panels in this page here, Tom. The pupils, of course. Where do you want to even start?
Well, let's talk about the stuff that's not here. That really is in panel 6. In panel 6, that panel where the burglar is being lowered down on the web and 2 cops are looking up, when Ditko penciled it, there were 3 cops. And there's a 3rd cop that's next to the guy on the left, and he's still fairly clear in the pencils if you look at the scan good enough. There is a note in the border that's from Art Simic, the letterer, and it reads, "Sorry about this. Have Steve lift it up," with an arrow to pointing to where that bottom caption goes up. Like that caption had to be high enough up that he obscures most of that where that second cop was. And I think Ditko, when he was, got the page back to ink, just went, it's easier. I'll just take him out rather than repencil him or move him. He's not that important. It'll work fine with 2 figures. The other thing that's pretty clear here, especially if you look at the original, is at the time the story was done, they hadn't made the decision yet to change the title of the magazine to Amazing Fantasy. And that what was originally lettered in that space was Amazing Adult Fantasy, which is why if you look at the word fantasy, it's kind of stretched out, and it's got 3 random dashes after it to obscure the space, because adult fantasy takes up a lot more space. Also, the most minor thing of all in the world, in the last panel, there had been a little corner box number indicating that it was page 11, but having 2 other captions there already, they decided to black it out and take it out for the final book. As you say, like probably the most surprising and maybe the most compelling panel here, from contemporary eyes, is panel 4, where you see the pupils through Spider-Man's mask as he does that take, and it's crazy. I remember seeing that, just flipping through a copy of Origins of Marvel Comics, at the local bookstore or whatever, and kind of doing a double take myself. Like, that's weird. What were they thinking? What were they thinking there? But again, they haven't worked out the iconography of any of this stuff, and it's there for emphasis. It's there to give you that he's surprised. There's at least one reprinting of this story where the reprint editor, who really should have known better, whited out the pupils, because Spider-Man's mask doesn't work that way. Got to fix it. And I'm not a believer in tampering with stupid stuff like that. Yeah, it's dumb. Yeah, it wasn't even a mistake. It was a decision. It was a choice here. You don't get 40 years after the fact or whatever to rethink the decisions that Stan and Steve made in this story. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, but neither does half the other events in this story. You don't have to fix them either. For whatever reason, looking at that burglar's face, Spider-Man's eyes bloom out to give you that Tex Avery sort of take moment. And again, there he's got a little indication of the shadow under his nose, which also intensifies that expression.
Tom, you bringing up in the bottom part, the hyphens used to kind of stretch out the space is now making me wonder a little bit. Obviously that very last panel with great power, we do have some hyphen work thrown in there to kind of stretch that out. Is there anything to that, or is that just for emphasis?
That's just for emphasis. There must also come
Okay.
pause, great responsibility.
Okay,
And again,
I just didn't know if it was like, no, there was 3 more words we were going to add.
Yeah,
like,
very great responsibility. Was,
very great.
No. There's no correction there. That's how Simic lettered it. There's some minor correction stuff, elsewhere on the page, but it's not. It's just typical stuff where already made a mistake and fixed it. So yeah.
Got it.
Are you privy to any of the behind the scenes of this motto being attributed to Uncle Ben in Spider-Man vs. Wolverine and the kind of evolution there? I mean, we take it for granted now that Uncle Ben said this to Peter at some point. But it was a long time until that would become like a very real thing.
Yes, well, again, probably the thing that cemented it in everybody's head more than anything else was that first Spider-Man movie.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's how they do it there, and that's how, modern generations where they most likely first encounter or majorly encounter Spider-Man is watching that Tobey Maguire Spider-Man 1. I don't know if it's available on Disney Plus right now, but Disney Plus. I don't know. I'll take your word for it that the first time it's attributed to Uncle Ben is Spider-Man Wolverine. I don't know that for certain off the top of my head. I do know that, again, over the years, a couple of things happened with it. The phrase changed, to with great power comes great responsibility. It's streamlined down that way for a long time. And it's a constant fight to get the correct version to be used consistently. Even in that first Spider-Man movie, what Uncle Ben tells him is, with great power comes great responsibility, and you want to smack him. No, it doesn't. That means something different. That means that that responsibility is endemic to the power you were given, and not the actual point here, which is that to use that power well and properly and wisely, you must also accept the responsibility to do so, which is the point. You choose. It doesn't happen automatically.
Whatever the mysteries are of the MCU Spider-Man's origin story, at least they got the motto correctly.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, they did, because they pay attention. They pay good attention to the source material, and they've probably heard any number of us bitch about this over the years.
Marissa Tomei had it in her contract. I will not say it incorrectly and get harassed by nerds for the rest of my life. Right?
That's right.
Yeah, because that's the reason nerds are harassing Marissa Tomei.
Yeah, right. No, exactly.
Do you have any thoughts on this forlorn image of Peter? It's always been a favorite of mine, just for its inclusion in a superhero book. It's just such an odd image to end the book with. Do you have any thoughts on that particular image?
Well, it's a good image. Certainly Ditko knows that Stan is going to write a bunch of stuff there. And so he leaves him a ton of room. And even with all the room that he's left him, Stan still needs to add another caption that goes completely across the bottom, cutting out poor cop number 3 in panel 6. So to some degree, the problem intimates the solution, which is, okay, says Steve, I've got a panel. Stan's going to blather at the top and the bottom, so I'm going to lose that. I have this much space in the middle, so Peter's got to be tiny. So I do him that way. It's going to have to probably be silhouette because there's not a lot of detail I can get at that size. Carmen Infantino style cityscape on either side, moon in the sky above him. He's just a silhouetted black figure that you just see, really like the spider symbol on his back and the belt maybe, and that's it. Even at that distance, that costume is so well designed that you can tell that that's Spider-Man. But again, I think that was much more a case of it's the end of the story and it's the first part of what's going to be a series. So Stan is not only going to end the story with the moral, he's also going to have to say, and there's going to be another one next month. So come back because it's going to be the most exciting thing ever. Better leave him a lot of room. So I think that's more than anything. In some ways, the panel before that is really the finale, and that's just kind of like visually the denouement. But it's definitely evocative. Ditko was always very good at his use of silhouette and composition and so forth, and that's probably a more effective panel if you take all of the words off of it and just imagine, right, black at the bottom and open sky at the top, and the framing on it. Spider-Man's figure is dead center. He's like a bullseye in that frame, and framed by the city around him that sort of closes in and is oppressive. And even there in that tiny little figure, you get a sense of him being sad and bent over, even though it's so tiny. There's no details at all.
Well, as the bottom of the page says, the end, and thus brings an end to our page-by-page discussion of this. But Tom, before we conclude it, I'm curious if you've had any reflections on this book now that it turned 60. There's been this whole process at Marvel of commemorating this anniversary, whether, with the Amazing Fantasy 1000, somewhere we missed I think 950 issues of Amazing Fantasy, but
I tell you, as regards that, and I'm going to get this out there in the world because that title is wrong. That title is wrong, and it wasn't my choice. It wasn't my book. It wasn't my fight, and it wasn't my thing. But that title bothers me and will bother me to the end of my days because that book was supposed to have been titled Amazing Spider-Man 1500.
Oh, tell us more about that.
Well, that's it. It was when it was first conceived, or when the first idea. I mean, it's a fairly obvious thing. We did Marvel Comics 1000 for the 80th of Marvel. Spider-Man's anniversary is coming up, and somebody, it wasn't me, but somebody said Amazing Fantasy 1500. Amazing Fantasy 15 is so well known, and 1500, there you go. But at a certain point, there was a concern, and it's not a wrong concern, that between Marvel 1000 and Action Comics 1000 and Detective Comics 1000, that fans and in particular retailers understood what a 1000th issue was. It's going to be an oversized celebratory yada yada yada, and maybe 1500 they don't understand so much, and so they're more hesitant to order it or whatever. I don't know all the ins and outs. I wasn't really a part of those discussions. That was all Nick Lowe, the Spider-Man editor, dealing with. But in the end, the decision was made, and I'm sure it was for good reason, to call it Amazing Spider-Man 1000. But damn it, that's Amazing Spider-Man 1500, because of course it is.
I mean, is there any concern that people might mix it up with Amazing Spider-Man 1000, which is actually coming in the next few years?
Maybe. I wouldn't think so, and I wouldn't worry about it. In that, it's similar. Yeah, it's Spider-Man, but a couple of years will have passed. And even if they, it's not like people are going to suddenly think, oh, that comic they did 2 years ago, they're putting it out again for some reason. Most of our audience is smarter than that and more knowledgeable than that. Again, this is entirely an aesthetic question on my part, rather than any particular other consideration. And there's nothing wrong with it being called Amazing Spider-Man or Amazing Fantasy 1000. It worked fine. People liked it. It was a great book. Nick got some terrific creators to do stories in it. I liked it a lot, and I don't like saying that about anything Nick does. But again, in my heart, it's one of those things where Amazing Spider-Man 1500 is better. It's just better.
Okay, well, that grievance aside, do you have any reflections on the 60th anniversary of this title?
People have been trying to duplicate this pretty much since the day it came out. Like really, in terms of characters that spawned from comic books, Spider-Man is maybe one of the three best known, most universally recognized characters. I would say that only Superman and Batman are equally and perhaps more greatly known. And these days, a bunch of the Marvel characters are starting to become more well known around the world. People generally know the Hulk, and definitely these days know Iron Man and so forth. But in terms of the real icons, if you took a machine gun and shot down everybody else who were not as part of the culture, you'd end up with Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man.
That's so violent, Tom.
I'm prone to that. Unlike Peter Parker, I never learned
the drama
about the responsibility and the power. I'm just drunk on the power.
Okay.
So like everybody when they try to do a new strip, including myself with my guys, you try and go out or you want to build something for the ages, and it's not impossible, but it sure is difficult. And Superman and Batman were created, or at least published, within a year or so of one another, and nobody since has done anything that's on that level except this. Other things have come close, have been good. It's not like there haven't been great characters. Wonder Woman is probably in the number 4 slot, and certainly people know Captain Marvel and any number of other characters. The Flash and whomever else, but to be that iconic, nothing else equals this. Really, even beyond Amazing Fantasy 15, when you get down to the body of work that is those Lee and Ditko Amazing Spider-Man stories, I love the Lee Kirby Fantastic Four. It's my favorite comic of that period. But if you corner me, I'll tell you that the best thing qualitatively that Marvel did in those days was the Lee Ditko Amazing Spider-Man. Those books are rock solid, and they're so ahead of their time and so forward thinking. And people have tried to duplicate this formula over the years again and again with characters like Nova or Firestorm or Darkhawk or a dozen others that showed up in one issue and disappeared, the Destructor and guys like that. And none of it has ever been able to tap into just the primal appeal of all of the elements that are in this 11-page story that kind of came together haphazardly. There's a whole Byzantine backstory as to how Spider-Man became a feature in the first place. That's very complicated and involves a lot more people beyond just Stan and Steve. But for all of those dominoes to fall in the right way so that you would get something as legendary and as impermeable, beyond any other Marvel character, this character will exist, long after all of us are gone, and pretty much long after everything else is gone. You'll just be, down to Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, maybe Sherlock Holmes, maybe Tarzan or somebody. It's staggering to actually stare at it.
And somewhere in the post-apocalypse, there will be a perfectly CGC'd copy of Amazing Fantasy 15 sitting there unread.
Sadly, it will only be a 3.5, but that's the best they're going to have. So, you work with what you got. It's an old comic book. What are you going to do?
And maybe some of those were damaged tonight while reading this. So maybe it's a 3.4
people are reading along.
Hey, Mark, that was a really awesome conversation with Tom. I do want to jump in here to say that if you find this show entertaining and valuable, we would love it if you would consider supporting us. First up, just recommending Amazing Spider Talk to a friend. We, have guests like Tom Brevoort on, and then, I look at the numbers of downloads, and I'm not really this kind of guy that obsesses over numbers, although I like to kind of keep an eye on it, because surely if I was really obsessed with numbers, I wouldn't still be doing this. But it would be great, just to kind of spread the Spider-Man knowledge and awareness of our show to other people. So, if you can give us a share or tell another fan or comic book lover about our show, we would love that. But, one of the things you can really do if you really want to support us is become a member of our Patreon.
That's right, Dan. We can only bring you all this content with the support of our Patreon members, and we owe the success to every single one of them. We are constantly making exclusive content for our Patreon members, too. This upcoming week, Patreon members will hear Alan, Dan, and my review of Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, Number 9. That's right, Dan is back! I'm back! To review Amazing Spider-Man comics with us.
Yeah, I am going to be back for this one. And I also wanted to throw in, I've been doing something new that is truly exclusive for our Patreon members. I've been doing Twitter space discussions with all of the Patreon members because I want to hear what you guys have to say about the comic. So, if you are, someone that enjoys Mark and I, and you want to engage with me, and maybe I'll find a way to pull Mark in one of these days, into the Twitter space, this is an opportunity for you to share your thoughts. So if you really are like, hey, I like Dan and Mark, but I disagree with them on just about everything, come join the Patreon and give us your 2 cents when we hang out in a Twitter space after each new issue. So I think for the past 3 or 4 issues, I've been doing these Twitter spaces, and they've been a huge success. So I just wanted to call people out about that. So yeah, you can take $3.99, the price of a new comic, and put it towards a month's subscription to support our show and start receiving all of this Patreon content. So you'll hear every new review episode of our Amazing Spider Talk feed, all those new issue reviews, the same week that they come out in the stores, rather than waiting like a month or so for it to arrive in our public podcasting feed.
And if you contribute $10 a month, you'll gain access to exclusive artwork from famous Spider-Man artists commissioned exclusively for our members. Plus, every episode we release a new episode-specific desktop background created for us by artist Nick Cagnetti for our patrons to enjoy.
Yeah, and we want this to not be financially burdensome to anyone who contributes. So again, if you just share and listen to the show, that's awesome. We love you for doing so. But if you do have the means, please join our Patreon to support the continued existence of our show. There's a link in this episode's description that'll take you right there, and you can see all your different options. And of course, as we always say, a big thank you to all the members who already make our show possible.
Well, it is that time, Dan. Time to hang up the webs, at least for now. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning into this episode of the Amazing Spider Talk. And, of course, a special thank you to Tom Brevoort for joining us on this episode. Thanks so much, Tom. What are you working on now? I mean, I asked that question with a smile through my teeth, that people can check you out. I mean, you're usually working on everything, but is there anything in specific you'd like to kind of plug or get out there for us?
Well, I am editing, what sometimes seems like all the Marvel comics. So you can look for those at your local comic retailer every Wednesday. I've also started up a weekly newsletter at Substack that's perfectly free and chock-a-block full of comic book history and nonsense from me. I'm still got the webpage, tombrevoort.com, which is where that amazing fantasy article and the other articles we've talked about exist and can be perused at your listeners' leisure. And I'm all over the social medias on the Twitter and the Facebook and the Insta and the this and the that. Typically under some version of Tom Brevoort, T. Brevoort, that guy Brevoort, what's a Brevoort.
This episode was edited by Rick Coast. Our artwork comes handcrafted by artists Ron Friends, Sal Buscema, Ray Sumser, and Nick Cagnetti. Our theme songs were produced by Rylan Bojack and SpiderMan. Plus, our introduction, animation, and musical stinger comes from Josh Sutton from the YouTube show Panels to Pixels.
This was a lot of fun, Dan, but what do we got coming up next?
Yeah, well, Mark, I've gotten a lot of emails about this, which is to say, when are you guys starting up the next season of the show? Will you ever be doing seasons again? You name it. I've gotten the email about it. And we know, like, I think our break after season 5 was like maybe longer than we intended. We were letting my wife and I kind of experience pregnancy and now childbirth, and maybe we should have just immediately rolled into season 6, but whatever. I feel mentally healthy. So yes, it is time for us to kick off season 6 in earnest. So in a few weeks, Mark and I are going to be kind of detailing what we're doing for season 6, but most specifically, we're going to be talking about the Tom DeFalco, Ron Frenz era of Amazing Spider-Man, and the kind of B-books and other cultural events around that era as Spider-Man's comic titles ballooned in the late and mid 80s. So we'll have more information to announce soon, but if you are one of those people that's got my email on speed dial, you can stop. Mark and I are actually going to do this. I'm going to be back from paternity leave, and we're going to get right back to doing our seasonal content. But we do hope this Beyond Amazing series, which is officially concluded now, was enough to kind of sate you for a little while.
I gotta say, Dan, I'm appalled that people are harassing you about that. You have a child. We gave people a 60th anniversary string of episodes. You got Available Alan and myself reviewing the new episodes. What more do you people want? It's a podcast. My God. Anyway, like we're not machines, people. But I am excited to get into this season. Obviously, I think probably part of the reason why people are so excited is because this is probably next to the Roger Stern run. It's probably a lot of people that follow our show closely. It's probably their favorite run of comics. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy, although we kind of got into that a bit during our Hobgoblin episodes. So, but I'm sure we'll touch on some of that fun again over the course of the season. It should be a good time, Dan. But seriously, if you have the patience of a saint to deal with those emails, if anyone reached out to me directly, we may not have fans based on my response.
Well, Mark, there's a reason I answer the emails.
There you go. Fair
no.
enough.
Look, it's nice to be wanted, right? Like if I wasn't getting emails, that would worry me more.
Fair enough.
Because then it's like, well, is anybody actually listening? So I appreciate the emails. Keep them coming. Mark, I even finally got a piece of snail mail about it too. We got a card in the mail. I created this whole P.O. box for people to write into, and no one did it for a year. So I went to go cancel the P.O. box, and then I found a card from one of our listeners in the P.O. box, and I haven't written him back yet, but I'm going to. But it convinced me it was worth keeping it open for the card. So,
all right.
So there we go. We are open to your snail mail enough to keep a P.O. box open for a year. But Mark, until next time, we have to leave everyone with our motto, the very thing that forms the backbone of our show. So Mark, until Amazing Fantasy 15 turns 100 years old and we get Tom Brevoort's Amazing Fantasy 1500, what's our motto?
Of course, that motto is, with great podcasts, there must also come, -- the Amazing Spider Talk.